Right, it's just setting it up on YouTube, so let me just check that's on mute. It is. And we have got already one person jumped in there. So good evening to those watching us on YouTube as well. Oh, Henry, how come you can't find anything in the chat? I've dropped in a document link. Can anyone, can everyone see that document I've dropped in?
Yeah.
At
Yes,
7:31.
yes.
Oh, it is there, Henry.
I
On the chat. On the chat.
I've sent it to you directly anyway.
Hey, I dropped it in as well. So to the extent that helps.
Right. Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Frank. Yeah, Ray, K8RWL. The club website is www.pennineham, all one word, Papa Echo, November, India, November Echo, pennineham.org.uk. And on there, you'll see the calendar. So be good to see you whenever you want to pop in. Okay, can I just give a big welcome? I'm going to hit the record button and then do a proper introduction to everybody. If you haven't already muted yourselves, would you mind doing that just so we don't get the dog barking and someone coming in the room inadvertently making a noise, dropping a pile of things on the floor, whatever it is. Let me just work my way around the room if I can't see it. Thanks, Rachel, and everyone else for helping out there. Okay, I'm going to hit the record button, do an introduction, and I'm then going to hand the microphone over to Frank. So, very big welcome to Pennine Ham and our meeting tonight on the 6th of November. We're delighted to welcome Frank, K4FMH. Frank is not a stranger to speaking at meetings in the UK. And of course, he is also a regular contributor and part of the group of people behind the ICQ podcast. And online tonight, we've also got Martin, M1MRB, who is the founder of the ICQ podcast, who's here tonight, who wanted to come along and watch Frank's talk. And we've got Martin coming to talk to us next month about the subject of how you fault find in your radio equipment, and doing it without blowing yourself up or destroying the equipment, hopefully. So looking forward to Martin's talk later on that. And we've got various others coming up between now and Christmas, including the people behind the TV programme TX Factor here in the UK, who are going to give a talk about the TX Factor and what they do. And I'm sure they'll be happy to take suggestions from people. So good evening, everybody. We've got Frank here tonight because apart from the fact that he's contributed on lots and lots of subjects regularly, both in the US and in the UK, but he wrote a series of 3 articles based on a paper that Frank put together. They appeared in Practical Wireless. The first one was in the February edition of PW this year, on the subject of the transmit quality of modern HF transceivers. And I don't want to steal anything from Frank's articles or his contribution tonight, other than to say we've all obviously in this room, and in fact we had Rob Sherwood come and gave a talk to us at the Denby Dale Club when we were running their online meetings on the received quality of modern radios, and that's a fascinating report. And we all talk about how well the modern radio works. But very rarely does people mention transmit quality. And of course, whether we're operating CW or single sideband, the transmit quality is an extremely important factor about whether we're going to be heard, how well we're heard, and if we're heard at all or we're understood. So it's a very important subject for radio amateurs. So I was delighted to read Frank's 3-part series of articles. And I thought that the best way of introducing the subject would be to get Frank here tonight. So big welcome to everyone. Welcome to our viewers on YouTube as well. And welcome as well, of course, to those that are watching this later this week or even later in the month, who catch up with our meetings on YouTube. I got a lovely email from a regular visitor to our YouTube channel from India, who also produces his own YouTubes for the radio amateur community in VU in India, where he lives. And a big welcome to you as well. And maybe we'll set up. I know the time of night we run our meetings is not going to be good for the poor guys who live in India to come along and give us a talk. But I was thinking one day we might run a special one in an afternoon one day and get our friend in India to come and talk to us about what he gets up to and amateur radio in India, because I think it would be an interesting subject, and there's a lot of fascinating work going on there, particularly with the building of various kits and QRP work and so on of interest to everybody. So, Frank, I'm going to hand the microphone over to you and let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much. And I greatly appreciate the invitation to join you under sort of your new auspices, if you will. And let me compliment you on making that transition. I'm a volunteer with ARRL, or what I call a volunteer flunky. And I kind of work with clubs that have growth pains. I'll put that gently. And I've been working with one over in Vicksburg, Mississippi, who had needed some help in getting restarted. But good clubs grow and diverge. And Martin Butler's given a talk at RSGB in the past about that natural proclivity. And so let me compliment you on how you have continued to pursue your elements of the hobby in a very mature way. And so again, I applaud you. As you know, not every club is successful. So here, and thank you for having me. I don't know if it'll be a good talk, but I may help you go to sleep early tonight. So I hope not, but perhaps there'll at least be that. I'm going to share a screen, and I want to just verify that you can. Boom. Let's see. Sometimes when PowerPoint goes into the actual slides. Now, can you see that okay?
Absolutely perfect. It's absolutely fine,
Great.
Frank.
Okay. As Nick said, I had been doing some work on measurements of radios. My PhD's in sociology and statistics, and for years I taught measurement in the social sciences. But as I began to study measurement from workbench equipment, I found out through Bob Witte, W-I-T-T-E, an American ham in Colorado who used to work for Hewlett-Packard and wrote some books on bench test equipment, that they used the same true score theory. And so Bob and I became good friends, and I've learned a lot from him. And I've learned a lot from Rob Sherwood. Certainly the Sherwood tables are among the most famous measurements we have in our hobby, certainly the English-speaking world. So I'll use that as a point of departure to talk about transmit quality among modern transceivers. And at best, I would call this speculative reasoning using publicly available bench tests. I was delighted to have Rich Moseson of CQ Magazine, which, as you know, has now ceased publication. I hope this article didn't help them move into that, but he published an article on the Sherwood Tools web pages that I published at one of my websites, foxmikehotel.com. That was in the January 2023 issue of CQ. And the transmit noise measurements are the latest part of that. Now, Nick and I both have given you a Dropbox link to my public Dropbox folder, and under TX quality, if you'll navigate there, you'll see a copy of this CQ article, as well as the three-part series that Don Field very kindly published in Practical Wireless in 2023. Copies of these articles are there as well. I don't think Don would mind. Let me encourage you vociferously to subscribe to Practical Wireless if you don't already. So this three-part series provides a research which underlies this talk. Nick, I'm going to have to ask Martin to not tell his son Colin, I'm not wearing the company shirt tonight in bright orange. So, Martin, don't tell Colin on me. He'll dock my pay next month. Now, when Rob Sherwood wrote an article that was published in QST in November 2019, and he told me privately, Frank, I just can't believe they published it. It's time to clean up our transmitters. I believe it set a mental benchmark for amateur radio operators and manufacturers. His testing of transmitter performance got results that he was very surprised at, that none of the modern transceivers in their transmit portion even met the same transmit purity of his Collins 32S3. Collins goes back, as we all know, many, many years. So that was a surprise to him. He mentions that in that QST article. Now, Rob outlined three key elements of transmitter output that can be problematic. I will analyze the first one, and that's broadband transmit noise. Another, if you're a CW operator, one of the things you look at, both hearing other operators as well as in your own transmitter, are key clicks from the CW carriers. And the third one is SSB splatter. We have all experienced, particularly during field day or other operations where there are a lot of transmitters on the band, someone splattering far wider than they certainly need to be. Now, I'll only look at that first one, but as Sherwood has said, it's often the worst offender. Broadband transmit noise isn't often noticed until you have a situation where two stations are physically close. Well, let's think about it for a moment. When you're talking, you're not listening, right? You may be monitoring your own voice, for example, but you're not hearing your signal as well. You may record it, you may listen to it later. And so we often don't really think about transmit noise. And Rob argues, gives us a little history. It really wasn't much of an issue back in the days of crystal control transmitters. Oh, for the days. Oh, but yes, we only have so many crystals and we just want to go everywhere. So how do we do that? We synthesize the frequency. And early on, the frequency synthesis circuits worked, but they weren't very good. And they had phase noise. And it was bad on both receive and transmit. But over time, engineers reduced that phase noise problem. And it's largely not nearly as much of a problem these days. The other kind of noise is amplitude or AM noise, which has received almost no discussion in transmitter evaluations. We're going to hear more from that and more from people other than Rob Sherwood. We're in a strong signal environment. I often think in a field day, I have a portable operations team that I'll put together, and sometimes we get on each other's receivers. But total noise is the most important, Rob Sherwood says. It's the composite noise, which is what our radios hear on the air, which may degrade reception. And we may not be aware of where that noise is coming from or what is generating it. And that was kind of Rob's argument. Here's a graphic that he got from Conrad Farlow, PA5Y. Rob supplied that to me. He had this in his QST article, but to be honest, QST doesn't do a great job with publishing graphics. So he was kind enough to send me one that you might have a chance at actually reading. He illustrates composite noise, which is this little green line. By the way, in that Dropbox link, I have a PDF of my slides. So any of you who would like to look at these in more detail, you can kind of zoom in. And if your eyes are like mine, you may need to zoom in quite a bit to get the detail. But these will be there. So this green line is the composite noise, and this is at a 20 kilohertz offset. So if you're listening off 20 kilohertz from a transmitted signal, this is what we're talking about. In this particular case, it's an ICOM IC7300. They've sold over 100,000 of them, they say, and it's on 20 meters. Now, the AM noise, black, you'll notice this line. Look at the phase noise. and see how at 100 hertz, we get up to a kilohertz, and this is the logarithmic scale. Look at how that composite noise, even as you have a larger and larger offset, look at how much it stays up there as a stronger part of what you're hearing. Phase noises, for the most part, if you're off with any kind of offset, it largely fades away. So he illustrates how important the total noise is for transmit quality. And I'll summarize this a bit. He makes a point in QST, one of the premier magazines. Well, he was not the first one. Now, in 2005, Leif Asbrandt over in Europe, he may have been the first one, and I'll show some of his work in the next slide. He really demonstrated how a lot of the reviews just don't deal with this. Now, later, Jim Brown, K9YC. Jim is sort of famous for working in the world of audio, dealing with noise particularly, and Jim Brown is the one who has a paper published on his website that is sort of the Bible, if you will, for using ferrite chokes and things of that nature. You may have seen K9YC's papers. He really goes on a tear and really criticizes the ARL's reviews and says, look, if a rig transmits phase noise 20 dB louder than competing radios, the ARL review should say that in plain English and state that such radios should not be used to drive a power amplifier. Well, Jim was in a little bit of a favored position. He was able to get test lab data from Bob Allison, certainly one of the best representatives of ARL ever and a good friend of mine. The ARL considers their lab data proprietary. Jim was able to get them, and he has an unpublished paper that sort of looks at different radios. It's a different set of them, only those reviewed by ARL. And he concluded that the price of the radio actually works against good noise figures. And he says that the more money you spend on a radio, the worse the noise. And it runs in some manufacturers. And he kind of wags the finger at certain manufacturers for having bad radios. Well, he's certainly a critic, and I'm not shocked that the ARL didn't publish this paper. They did loan him the data. Now, they publish information about transmit noise, but if you read QST, and I'll show you this in the next slide, they only publish a graphic. And quite frankly, it's a little difficult to compare graphs if you're comparing one radio to another. And I emphasize they're considered proprietary data. They don't release the key data to all members. Jim is the only one outside of Newington, Connecticut that I'm aware has ever gotten these data. He says he's lost it. The laptop that he had it on died and what have you. And Bob Allison tells me that even before he left and retired from ARL, that it was considered proprietary and he was not able to share it. So that may be why manufacturers have not done a lot toward making their radio transmit noise better. Sometimes if you publish things in the automotive world, car makers tend to improve things, right? So that may be part of the reason. Here is an example of the graphics published on 3 reviews by ARL. I did tell you I'm a life member, right? So I'm not just throwing stones at them intentionally. I'm trying to be objectively critical. Here's a transmit noise of a Elecraft KX3. I recently picked up one of these. They're marvelous little radios, and they get a very high rating on Rob's receive metrics. Here's the very popular Kenwood TS590 and one of the well-known ICOM radios, the IC706. Can you tell one graph from another? I can't. Maybe. I mean, the 7600 looks a little narrower here. Gosh, you get a lot of wavy lines here, and you look at the frequency of the character, and you look at offsets. But I'm just not able to see a whole lot of difference there. So what good does that do? Well, Leif Asbrandt really took them to task in a follow-up paper. It was unpublished. He said, I find it highly inappropriate that the ARL reviewer chose not to characterize the performance of the level of performance like this. Overall, the composite noise output as shown in figure 3 is low. Gosh, for Asbrandt, that's a little bit like being in the operating room, of which I'll be in one on Tuesday, and saying, gosh, the patient's heart stopped a few minutes ago, but not saying this is bad. And so he's talking about the Flex 1500 SDR QRP radio. I have one. I have one in a little box. I bought it before I read and did this work. The Gaz Lab YouTube channel, the proprietor of that works for one of the major companies in England. He was talking about what a great bargain that Flex 1500 was. So I found one and bought it. I haven't noticed transmit noise, but again, we don't listen when we're talking, right? So Asbrandt really says, I'm confident that many will agree those noise sidebands are unacceptably high. Well, what do people do with that 1500? Some operate QRP, but they had a lot of them sold to drive a transverter to go up into VHF, UHF, or microwave. And I'm told that word quickly got out. The noise is terrible when you make it louder. So Asbrandt conducted some independent tests. I'll show just a little bit of that in a minute. Not unlike Jim Brown, he showed that the analysis of even a small number of well-known transceivers can illustrate how much variability there is in the particular radio. Here's some of his work, and I'll try to be quickly here, go through here. You got everything from the Elecraft K3 on down to several flex radios. And here is the received noise, dB relative to carrier, which is a measure of power in a sideband. And the difference column between receive and transmit, he talks about the negative figure indicates that the receiver dynamic range is poorer than the sideband noise suppression. You're getting a good transmitter, good receiver type of thing. Positive indicates that the transmitter is better. Negative, the receiver is better. So let's look at a few of these. The venerable K3, of which many contest operators worldwide would say one of the best contest radios ever made. They really have a strong following. Well, it happened to be negative. So the receiver was better than the transmitter. Let's think about that. If you're a contester, you kind of want to hear the weak ones, right? Well, that's not surprising. So when you go look, you can see that KX3, that many QRP operators like me, it's very highly rated on Rob Sherwood's receive list, but it's got a positive number. The transmitter is the better of the two. Wow, that's kind of surprising. The punchline is this: unless we measure, we can't tell. And so we need to measure. Well, receive improvements have been made, and I'll demonstrate that to you using Rob's data. Has there been any progress in transmit purity? When Scott Wright, K0MD, was editor of the National Contesting Journal for the ARL, he invited me to submit some papers that I was developing on receive quality and what radios cost. And I'll show some of that. There has been demonstrated improvement in receive quality over time, especially since 2010. And it'll be dramatic in the next slide. But what about manufacturers' response in the 18 or 19 years since Asbrook and Brown's critique of transmit quality? And more recently, 5 years ago now, of Rob Sherwood's prominent article in QST. Yet QST has had no appreciable change in the format of the test lab data. There's some progress in independent bench testing, and I'll share some of those data with you here. Here's a graph I think makes my point. If you look at Rob Sherwood's table, you'll see there are 9 measurements. He quickly tells you, I'm a CW contester, and I'm here to tell you that narrow dynamic range is the holy grail for CW contesting. I've talked with Rob for many hours. He's a consummate professional. He and I get along fabulously, and I may have bugged him a time or two, and he's been very good at bringing me up to speed on some issues, and I've taught him some statistics along the way. So it's been a good partnership. I took all of his measures and put them together in a statistically sound way to create a Sherwood Performance Index. There are 9 measures put together from his bench test. And over time, we've got from 1954 to 2018 with these data. That's well over a half century, over 60 years. And the average of 100, this is an arbitrary metric, a little like an IQ test with an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Look at how over this horizon, look what happens in the early 2000s. It begins to jump, and suddenly around 2010, we are now over 2 standard deviations, over 30 points better than the 60-year average. So our receive performance has gotten so much better in this century. It truly is amazing. Rob had been saying that, but he'd never seen his own data arrayed by year that the radio was introduced to the marketplace. So receive performance has clearly gotten better. Well, since ARL and no other group releases their transmit test, a team of European amateurs centered around Cyprus, they called themselves Team Charlie, TK0C, and Rob Sherwood, they've been testing some of the modern transceivers for measures of transmit purity. Now, Rick Westerman, DJ0IP, has a website. He has curated them on his website. I use those data supplemented by data that Rob sent me privately, Rob Sherwood. And now I've published many of those on my own website, so they are available. And so I've got I don't have a lot of radios. They're not nearly as many as Rob has on his receive table, but I do have some of the latest ones, including the Elecraft K4D, the FTDX10, which I'm proud to own, and its little brother, the FT710. And so the composite transmit noise measurements for each radio I built into a data set along with the Sherwood receive test, the price at and the year of market entry, and the average EHAM consumer satisfaction score. If you remember the old Life cereal, if you had that in England, in the commercial, at least from the States, it was a little kid in a chair sitting in his nappies, and they'd say, let's see if Mikey likes the cereal. And Mikey liked it, and they advertised that breakfast cereal because Mikey, the little kid, liked it. So in a sense, EHAM is like, does Mikey like a radio? Do other hams like it? It's the only consumer satisfaction score that we have available. So let me just briefly go into a couple of technical weeds here on broadband composite transmit noise, because it does get important, as Sherwood said in his QST paper. We need to look at the roll-off, that is, how does it drop across different frequency offsets, and we use 3 here. It was measured by the group in Cyprus and by Rob using a direct sampling SDR receiver at 100 watts, 50 watts, and 10 watts CW output on 20 meters, and those are the most common drive level. The 1500, the Flex 1500 was a QRP radio. It was measured at 5 watts. The QSR1 SDR was used by the group in Cyprus, and Rob used a Perseus SDR, which he and I both own. And I used the results for 50 watts. That seemed to be some reasonable middle share rather than shotgunning people with the same data across the different power levels. I used 3 offsets that are commonly used, 10, 20, and 100 kilohertz. in dB to the character relative to hertz. And I've got these in the slides. I'll let you take a look at them. The source for these data are here again. They're on the slides, and I'll leave that to you. So here's what I do here. I describe composite transmit noise. Okay, let's look at them. Are they all alike, or are they very different? And if so, which ones are different from the others? Which ones are better? Which ones are worse? Second, how does transmit quality relate to receive quality? If you've got a low noise transmitter, do you tend to have a high receive performance? Well, what does that cost? What does it cost to get a good radio? That's the fundamental here. What year did it enter the marketplace, and how have hams evaluated it? Do they like this radio? Do they not? Well, how do we put things together? And as a statistician over my career, I've focused on how do we make sense of data? We can look at data all day long, but how do we put them together in meaningful groups that are similar enough and different from other groups that they tend to make sense? And so I use a technique called cluster analysis. I'll explain that. It's mostly visual, and this will help you see these results. Let me wave my arms and say this. There are two key things that I don't have measures of. I don't really know how to get measures of them. I think it's tremendously challenging. That is the features that they have. What is a feature? The old joke about that's not a bug, that's a feature. That sort of illustrates some subjectivity. Now, we all have certain features that are pretty standard, right? We have some sort of noise reduction. We have some sort of digital speech processor. Those have become features. But if you go back 50 years, those radios didn't have those. So I've actually had a ham Jim W6LG with a very popular YouTube channel. He said, "Oh, I'll take that and I'll make a table out of it." I've heard nothing but crickets since Jim jumped into that 2 years ago. It's exceedingly challenging. I would like to see him be successful. And the second thing is ergonomics. You'll find that, for example, from Yaesu's radios, they got a lot of kickback for their concentric VFO knobs. People with big hands would say, "Oh, I'll get the inner one right and I'll touch the outer one and it changes it." I hate that. Now, ergonomics vary. What someone wants to take on a soda event, that depends probably on how young they are. Young folks might be able to handle a heavier radio. That's a little subjective. But what I try to do is to equalize these radios on their receivability measured on the bench, their transmit noise measured on the bench, what they cost at market entry new, what others think about them, and how old or young are the radios. Now, with all those held equal, you figure out what features and economics you want, and among those better performing ones in your price range, then I've reduced the needle in a haystack down to finding a needle in a handful of hay, or at least I think I have. So our strengths and weaknesses, internal validity is clearly the strength. These were all consistently done, but I don't have all the radios out there you may want to buy. So there's a weakness of external validity. And at best, I'd call this speculative reasoning using publicly available bench test data. And we just are not getting that from some of our national societies. Okay? All right. Now, what does it look like? Here's a table with the radios in my study. And at 10 kilohertz, 20 kilohertz, and 100 kilohertz, these are the dBc to hertz measurements of composite noise. So for the Apache 7000, you'll see that it goes in this direction. Here's the average. And here's how much they vary. If you carefully read Rob Sherwood's QST paper, he talks about how these things vary is one important criterion, because you'll have one ham say, radio X, you can dial that in and it's quiet and I can hear the weak ones. And you'll say, well, I have to open it up before I can hear anything. That's a reflection partly of these offset measures, for instance. I put all these together the same way I did that Sherwood Performance Index, so that 100 is the average expressed as a median and a standard deviation of 15. For example, the Anon had the best noise down at 72 and change, whereas the Flex 1500 had the highest noise, the worst characteristic. And that difference is 29 dB. That's 29er dB at 10 kilohertz. So are you getting affected by that noise? Probably, but from those two, probably. So I've got a little table here that you can look at your leisure, but let's get visual. Here's one of the problems of ranking data. Rob does a great job with the Sherwood tables, and he rank orders them. And he gets so many people saying, oh, but the number one, the FTD 101MD, it's 0.2, better than the second one. And Rob goes, and you couldn't tell the difference if you had to. The top 10 are probably figuratively the same. But here's a graph that I created. Here's the worst radio. Here's the best radio. And as you see, if you look at their ranking in reverse order and you didn't look at the data, you say, all these are implicitly equally different, and they're not. You can see these two. Look at this big gap here. You've got about 7 points. 7 points is half a standard deviation. That begins to be big in terms of data. Look at the three Elecraft radios. So over time, and you're going to hear me say this 3 more times, Elecraft got consistently better in reducing noise in their radios. Well, as I told Eric Schwartz at a recent Hamfest, one of the virtues of Elecraft is that they have one desktop radio model. ICOM's got how many? Yaesu's got how many? Flex has got how many? So they have the luxury of focusing with Wayne Burdick, their engineer, focusing on one basic design. And they've improved it, and we'll show some more data on that. And here you get these jump. You get these two that are ranked, and they're almost identical. They should be. They're very similar circuits, right? So again, you see the rank order of these. At different offsets, you can tell that they aren't the same. They correlate highly, but they aren't the same. But if you looked at the average, you would expect the gap to go down. But until you look at the individual radio, you can't really tell what's what. And I hope that helps illustrate, some of that. All right, wow. Let me take my own glasses off here. This will get you confused. I told you I'd put you to sleep before this was over, right? Okay, this is a goofy graph from statistics called a parallel coordinates plot, right? Okay. I could have done better on the graph. Here's the manufacturer and their radios. Here's Anon, it got covered up, Elecraft, Flex, ICOM, Kenwood, and Yaesu. Now, I took the flagship radio for each manufacturer to illustrate, and I made thicker blue lines. So let's look at Anon. So here's the Anon 7000. What's the noise level for the Anon 7000 at 10 kilohertz? Why, it's the best. What about 20 kilohertz? It's second best. Well, which is that one that beat it out, not on 10 kilohertz, but at 20 kilohertz? Well, it's the Flex 6700. So if you'll take the time up and look at Anon, it was third at different offsets, but overall, the Anon was best on the composite index. So it helps you do what Rob Sherwood said we need to do. Not every radio performs identically at each gap, each frequency offset. This helps you see it perhaps a little better than that table. Now, here's the first punchline. There are distinctive differences among flagship transceivers and transmit composite noise. Some flagship radios rank no better than the manufacturer's own mid-tier radio on transmit noise. Now, Sherwood complained in his QST paper, some manufacturers have focused on receive capability to the detriment of transmitter development. Well, remember, the customer's not thinking about that when they're talking. They think about it when they're listening, right? Now, Brown claimed that there were bad manufacturers that had bad radios that cost more. We'll see. I'll give you a hint. He's wrong in these data. But these results place a finer point than either Brown or Asbrink did in their fine analyses. They just weren't as complete. And hopefully it's a nominal response to Rob Sherwood's paper. Okay. Are lower transmit noise radios better receivers? I mean, we want a good low noise transmitter and a great receiver, right? We all want that. So what does it cost? If you pay more, can you get better? I showed in my earlier papers that yes, you can get a slightly better receiver by paying more, just not what you think money's going to buy you. Because as I said then, if money bought great reception, we'd all be saving our shekels to buy what? What's that German radio? Hilberling? We'd all be buying Hilberlings, right? Now, what are the optimal transceivers on both noise and receive performance? Can we find one? And at what price does better performance at both cost? Okay, here's the scatter plot. Here's the Sherwood Performance Index. The higher the number, the better on all of Rob's tests, right? And the Sherwood Performance Index as I put them together. Here's the composite noise. We want low. So ideally, what we want is a radio right over here. The ideal radio would have the very, very best receive and the absolute lowest transmit noise, right? Let's see what's on our Christmas or Boxing Day list, right? Nothing. There's none of them that do both, right? Well, how close can we come? What's the best? We could get the Anon. It's got the best transmit noise, but it's just a little above. It's about a standard deviation and change above the average of reception. Oh, the Flex 67, it does better in receive. It's got only slightly more noise, right? Look at the Elecraft line. They've plodded along and consistently gotten lower noise, okay, because this is going down. And guess what? They've gotten better receive performance too. My hat's off to them. I can't afford a K4D. My friend Scott Wright, K0MD, he went from ICOM to Elecraft, and he loves his K4D. So it's coming close to doing what we like, the 101D. It's got great receive. It's got higher noise. So as you can see here, the different manufacturers vary, and there's not one radio that does both like we'd have to. Only Elecraft and maybe Yaesu have continued to get better on both of these. What does it cost, right? Here's the Hilberling question. If money bought receive performance, we'd all be buying Hilberlings. We want low transmit noise, and we don't want to pay much, right? I mean, who wants to pay more than they have to? So we want a radio that goes below this blue line, which is the average price of about 3,300 US dollars. You'd have to put that over in British pounds. So let's look at this. So what's below the median noise? You've got two of the Elecrafts, the older K3 and K3S, the K4D. They're kind of proud of it today. You can buy these on the used market pretty well. And I have people that still say they'll take my K3 when it burns up, lightning strikes it, or from my cold, dead fingers. So here's some measurements that suggest that. If you want to go up a little bit, the Apache is worth looking at. Okay, where's the elephant in the room here? Wow. It's it's not as, it's a little bit better than average on noise, but it is, it's really over 3 standard deviations more expensive than the other radios. Don't think I'm saying this is a bad radio. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying if you're interested, think about what it is you're paying for it. I'm sure Rolls-Royce feels like their cars are worth it. And to some people, they are. But what are you getting with a more expensive radio? You're not getting better transmit noise, for example. And so this has got a lot of virtues to it. I'm trying to help hams think about how they spend their money and getting really something that fits them best. I've got several of these radios. The venerable TS590 SG is a wonderful radio. I let somebody talk me out of it. He offered me a PAL-Star kilowatt amplifier straight up trade. He was like giving me $1,400 USD. So I had to take that trade. He was a grown adult and he did it. So there you go. Now let's look at this. How do we put both receive and transmit together? So I thought, well, a lot of times the ratio is something that's good to do this with. So I took the ratio of receive performance to transmit noise. Okay. And if you do a ratio of that, a 1-to-1 ratio means they're both average. They're both average. And the higher this ratio, the better receive you get for the noise. And we put those together, the Anon finishes in second place with the Flex 6700 in first place. And as you begin to go down, this is why rank data is fine and we all like ranks. Look at the huge gap between the 7600 and the TS590 SG. If you just looked at this rank, you would never expect these two to be so different. And so this dot plot sorted in terms of what they're ranked on really helps us see that. Okay, so what are these costs relative to these? Here we go. Here's the price, and then here's this ratio, right? We want a better ratio. 6700 had the highest ratio. Well, it's out here in the $7,000 range when it was introduced. The Anon was in there, and the K4D is in there. So ideally, we'd like one right up here. The perfect one would be the best ratio, receive and transmit for the lowest cost, right? Well, if we think about that, how different are these? Maybe the 101D as well. How different are these in what's in your pocketbook and in your heart, right? Maybe you've had a couple of pints and you want to open that pocketbook up. Whatever, however you make your decision. But this helps you put it in order. And once again, measured receive performance, transmit noise. This is not what you're getting for what you're paying for this radio. What you're paying for this radio may well be worth it. Nick, did you have Curtis Mathis televisions in England back in the day? Does that ring a bell? Curtis Mathis.
They don't ring a bell, Frank, no.
Curtis Mathis was a Hilberling-like television in the States. You know what their advertising slogan was? Expensive, but darn well worth it. Well, this may well be worth it. Don't anybody say, come away and says, K4FMH said this is a bad radio. I'm not. It's a great radio. Do you want to buy it? That's the question. So now, are lower transmit noise and transmitters, do they even notice? Or they've noticed by hams? Does the consumer satisfaction vary here, the EHAM rating? And what you're going to find is almost no relationship. So for transmit noise, it's just not a direct factor. You'll see that the Elecraft line is very popular. Now, I have one Elecraft radio, the KX3, so I'm not just reflecting being a fanboy here. So this is where you want to be, low transmit noise and high EHAM satisfaction. Mikey really likes that bowl of cereal. So it's almost no relationship there. Let me point one thing out. A lot of people wonder about the FTDX10, and it gets a low EHAM rating. I've gone through and read every review on EHAM for all of these radios many times. The main theme out of this is that Yaesu came out with a menu system that many hams absolutely hated and gave them very low reviews. And so a small, not too small, but a number of low reviews on the menu system alone. What did they do differently when they came out with the FTDX10 and the FT10? They changed the menu system. They let you use a mouse. You can click one button and every other button pops up on the screen. And so they bypassed the problem with the menu system there. That's a sidebar. All right, has there been any improvement? Okay. Well, look at the year and the time horizon is about 25 years, and has there been any consistent progress? You go back to 94 and the data on the radios I'm using back to the FT1000MP, still highly regarded by hams during that era and purchased one. Nothing wrong with them. They just do what they do. So when you look at it, there's just not much of a relationship here. I'll point out Elecraft. I got to give them their due. They have consistently made about a third of a standard deviation improvement over these three radios. Yaesu, okay, you got they're bebopping here, boom, here, then they're they're down here, and so they're a little bit erratic. They're not making a consistent improvement. I think it's because they've got multiple radios going. Elecraft, Wayne Burdick gets to focus on one. So the punchline is there's very little general improvement in lowering transmit composite noise. Okay, I've given you a bunch of what might be gobbledygook to many people who don't relish statistics. Here's how I put them together. Here's an illustration. I'll have a chart that'll be much bigger and clearer, and I'll show a scatter plot, but I'll have the groups that I was able to identify color-coded, so you'll see how they put together. Then how is that group profiled? Here is each profile, and then here's each radio. That's what it's going to look like, and here's what it is. So group one, here, one, right here. Two strange bedfellows. The FT710 and the TS890. You can buy several 710s for $1,890. But here's what it's characterized by. You can see the green is the price. 100 is average on all these. The tan is the EHAM score. The red is composite noise. Low is better. And blue is the Sherwood Performance Index. So these two radios, this group, they're a little bit below the average price. People kind of like them. Their noise is a little above average, but not dramatically so. And they're really good receivers. They get really good bench measurements. The absolute top of all these groups will come down here to the second one by 1 point. All right, group two, the Flex 6400, 6600, the FTDX 101D, first 100 dB narrow dynamic range radio on Sherwood's table ever. Its successor, the FTDX10, I enjoy mine. The 7610, which I will note, not everybody realized that it has adaptive pre-distortion, pure signal, that ICOM has now released in firmware, so you can sample the transmitter, get the transmitted signal, feed it back, and it will adjust that so you get a brick wall filter on transmit. Not everybody realizes the 7610 has that. So group two radios, they're a little bit below average price, almost at the average. Not everybody likes them. That's largely the FTDX 101. They have average transmit noise. They're right at the average. They are great receivers. They are right there. They're right there. You get this one, all right there. And so you can see why some of these radios are revered, because they're really good receivers. They don't hear the transmit noise. Some don't like the menus. All right, here's group three. The Flex 1500, which has raked over the coals. Several of the earlier Yaesus and later ones, and several of the ICOMs and the Kenwood 590 SG. Well, what characterizes them? They're middle of the road. They're not great. They're not bad. They're very solid. Little below average on price. People kind of like them. They're okay. They tend to have a little more noise. That's not great, but we don't hear it. Remember when we're listening? A little above average receiver. So they're that middle in the road, if you call it plain vanilla, but that might fit them. So number 4, the Apache, the Flex 6700, and all 3 of the Elecraft radios. Average price, little higher. People like them. People like those radios. They're about a standard deviation above average. And if you read AHAM, you got to do some bad stuff to get a bad rating. So they're mostly high, and so these are up there. Number 4 gets lower noise. Remember, this one was the lowest. This one jumped up in the ratio. These were not bad. So it's got the lowest transmit noise, and it's got very good receiver performance. So number 4, about average price, gets you these characteristics. And number 5 is the ICOM 7851. It was unique. It was totally in its own group. It's 53 points above average with a standard deviation of 15. That's what, over 3 standard deviations? More expensive. People like it. 1 standard deviation above. It's got average noise or less. Really good receiver. So these are some groups I was able to pull out of the data and feel confident with them. I've analyzed the heck out of those groups, done that for decades. I feel pretty confident that this reflects these radios. Now I'll show you this one, and you can see how the 7851 is by itself. This is composite noise and received noise, but color-coded by cluster group. Price and EHAM are not in this graph, so keep that in mind. And you can see the green group, the number 3, the plain vanilla average. You can see them there. You can see the number 1 group, the blue, which was simply 2 of the 2 radios here. Number 3, well, I said the green, and then number 4, these clustering together, and then number 5. So you can see these groups in data. Show you some of the optimal ones. Apache, Flex, Elecraft, and Yaesu all have contenders to be optimal. None are perfect, but those are optimal. The 7851 is in a group of its own, but only because of price. Okay? Now let me end with this. This is not definitive, but I hope it sets a template for future ones. I offer it as a nominal response to Sherwood's QST article calling for more studies. These 21 radios were tested not by me, but the European Tango group and Rob Sherwood. There's not one radio that reaches top received performance and low transmit composite noise. But there's no evidence that a higher price radio is more or less dirty than others. So Brown's analysis of ARL data, I'm sure they were accurate for those data, but I don't see them in these. In fact, the 7851, the highest price radio by far, it had pretty good composite noise score. What they do allow the reader to do is to say, look, I want to buy a new radio. I'm interested in certain things. This equalizes or tends to equalize subsets of these radios. And I'm looking to expend about this much money. Well, these 3 are in that price range. Now, I want to think about what I want in that radio. Am I going to move it around? How heavy is it? How sensitive is it? How ruggedly is it built? That might be some things. And the ergonomics. Do you like a point-and-click radio? That's been one of the big turnoffs to some of the Flex radios. Some people like knobs. You're either in one group or you're not. You can put a knob on a Flex radio, of course. So those are the things that I hope helping you narrow these down. And I will say this, we really need to push the ARL to publish all of their test data in a spreadsheet form on their website, restricted to members. I get it. You want people to join, but give it to all members. And transparency and independent analysis, in my humble opinion, always make for a more efficient marketplace in a capitalist economy. One thing I'll end with this. We need some human usability. I'm always asked, and Rob is always asked, how much of a difference in dynamic range does it take for you to realize it? Rob doesn't know. He knows for himself. He knows for himself. But we don't know, and we need some hams and actually a test environment to see how much difference in composite noise, for example, it takes for you to be able to tell. We know when it's really bad because you can hear it. And so we also need some of the ergonomics to be looked at. Because manufacturers, if they're not guessing, they don't tell us how they come up with things. And there will be individual variations. Some people like some things, other people don't like. So there's no incentive for manufacturers to do this. They spent a bunch of money on advertising the positives of their product line. And automobile makers do the same thing, right? But we don't, as consumers, we shouldn't be left to scan the pages of magazines and websites and just look at the pretty pictures to evaluate purchases that can run up to 15,000 USD or more, depending on how much you want to spend. So anyway, I'll kind of end with this. I think personally the ARL should be an underwriter's laboratory like we have here in the States. Radios, they would have to have a pact with their advertisers that we're going to call it like we see it. And I can tell you that the only really negative review I've read in QST has been the Xiegu XPA 125 QRP amp. And guess what? Xiegu doesn't advertise. And I can tell you that, yes, they will go back to manufacturers of bad products and get them to fix things, change things, and they may not publish the review. So you're getting mostly positive reviews in QST. In my opinion, hams don't expect that. They expect a fair and honest review. But that is, in my opinion, what happens with QST and from talking the talking. Okay. I've got a page here at my Fox Mike Hotel website. It's in the PDF that I've given you on the Dropbox link. I would encourage you to take some time. I have some interactive tools that you can go play with today. It's illustrated in the CQ magazine article. And you can slice and dice and look in 3D space and do all that kind of stuff. And so, Nick, I'm going to end with this. And any questions, or you can't throw tomatoes at me because I'm across the pond. That's my only solace here.
Thank you very much, Frank. Very, very interesting presentation and a lot of information there. So thank you for making available the PDF, because I'm sure we're going to have some members who are going to go back and have a look at the PDF of your presentation there and look at some of those graphs that you published in
This
a
is
bit
what
more.
you should see in that Dropbox folder. You'll
Yeah.
have several PDFs, and that should be there. And this is the first page on my website that if you want to go look at it, there's some tools there. Some of you know, listen to the podcast. I had prostate cancer. I had surgery back in June. On Tuesday, I'll have my right shoulder rotator cuff repaired in my bicep, and I'll be in one of those slings for 6 weeks. So it'll be January before I'm able to be back in the saddle, but I will try to update some of these when I get the time. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to try to address them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Frank. A very, very interesting presentation. I think actually the nub of what you were writing about there, Frank, was in that question on one of your final slides there. And that's the question which you haven't attempted to answer. I'm not sure you can do because there's too much subjectivity there. But is how much can human being operators actually discern that greater amount of transmit composite noise? How aware are people of that noise in the transmission of that individual? And that seems to me quite an important one, doesn't it? Because, if I give an example before we throw it open to the floor, I've got one of the most popular, if not the most popular transceiver produced in the last decade or so, the ICOM 7300. I enjoy using it. I've had great fun with it. It's clearly got its drawbacks on the receive side, and there are better radios out there, but I still enjoy it. I've got no intention of changing it at the moment, but it comes out very, very poorly on the transmit quality, one of the worst performing ones. And that kind of probably surprises a number of us using the IC 7300, because it's quite often that we get good, reports on your audio quality from your radio. So maybe other factors, like the microphone you use, like the settings you use when you're adjusting it inside the radio itself, maybe they have more of an impact than that composite noise. And that's something which, someone probably needs to do a bit of work on. But you've raised some very, very fascinating issues there.
Thank you. I too have a 7300. I have it mounted in a portable case with a 500-watt amplifier. It's kind of my run station for my portable ops team. And one of the real virtues, I think, and on the feature that I did a few episodes ago on the IC podcast at the Huntsville, Alabama Hamfest, I spoke with Ray Novak. One of the really nice things that ICOM has done is on the features and ergonomics side. They have almost standardized their menu interface, beginning with that 7300, the 705, the 9700, and some of the other radios. And I think the 905 latest rendition. If you know one of those, you're very comfortable sitting down at the other one. And that goes a long way with operators. Where the 7300 has been lacking, I try to solve it by putting a bandpass filter system in. Is when you're around other radios transmitting, its front end isn't quite as robust, maybe, as another one, but it's been certainly one of the most popular HF radios and ham radio of the past maybe decade. I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, should we chuck it out? Who's got a question, comment, observation to put to Frank about his presentation this evening? Who wants to go first? They're all still awake, Frank, but
well, Martin's still awake. I see him looking up there. He has his Yoda cloak on. He's got his Yoda cloak.
I have. Okay. I thought it was brilliant, Frank. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, like Nick, I'm a 7300. I'm 7300 owner. It does what I do. I don't do much HF operating. I do like my Zygo G90 though, but we won't go that route. And yeah, I have a 9700 as well. So yeah, they were both bought at the time. I traded others in, exactly as Nick said, and you and Nick said, to end up with a common interface. But when I sit down in front of the radio, I don't want to be thinking which radio does what. So yeah. But some good, interesting stuff there, Frank. And let's say, hopefully, we can carry on a little bit later on in the week about this, because I think that was a good one.
Well, I will say there is a burden to having too many radios. Only, with respect to what you said, I'm guilty of that. I probably need to sell a few. You have to think about, wait a minute now, the Ella Craft, how do you get to the filter? Oh, it's different than I will say this in passing. I had an unopened Jagu G90 sitting on my shelf, and Rob and I were talking, and he said, Frank, you have a G90? He said, people are ringing me that I haven't tested any of those radios, but the way I do it, I go in the ham radio outlet in Denver, and they let me pick a box as a loaner, and then I go test it for a few months, and I bring it back. Just occasionally I purchased one that I was very pleased with, but Jago doesn't have a store. MFJ sold it. I said, well, I have one I purchased from Martin Jew at MFJ. I haven't had time to open it. Do you want to test it? I mean, I haven't touched it. So I shipped it to Rob. Rob tested it and shipped it back to me. And before I opened the Federal Express box, a portable operations team member of mine in 5DU says, "Hey, you want to sell it? I'll buy it from you." So I sold it to him. Well, the first time I used the radio that I bought that Rob Sherwood tested was at Mike's Shack. And then a little later, I wound up buying one and myself. So you have to think about each one of these darn things, and it can be a challenge. And I think you can have the exact same bench measurements, and different people will evaluate them differently.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, my little Zygo works for me when I'm out portable. And I often tell the story without boring people too much. I worked for one of the big ham radio dealers in the UK for about 10 months. I got made redundant, and while I was looking for another job, I ended up working for one of the dealers. And people used to come in and they'd say, "Well, which radio I got?" And they wanted to buy one, and I'd say to them, "What's your budget?" And then I'd line up 3 radios, and I'd say, "Well, these 3 fit what you're looking for." And they go, "Well, this one does that, and this one does this, one thing, another." And I used to say, at the end of it, you're better off on the bog standard radios just choosing the one that you think is eye candy. Because if you choose eye candy, and you're sitting in front of it and you like the look of it, you'll use it. If it was pig ugly, and God forbid, at the time, Tech made a radio which was outperformed. Performance was great, but God, was it ugly? You wouldn't use it. I'm sorry, Frank. That's not a very technical way of doing it.
Oh,
But
no, I've got friends who swear by their Tentex, and I agree with you, Martin. I grew up on a hog farm. I know what ugly looks like, and the Tentex are ugly.
Yeah. So it's like choose a rate. All right, the technical specs are great, and as you said earlier on, it's first off, it's great to know this and choose the best one you can. That A, you're happy looking at, I would suggest, and B, what you can afford. If you can't afford the top of the range, having a standard run-of-the-mill radio is more fun, because at least you're out doing something rather than sitting there dribbling over the magazines as they come in because you can't afford to buy one. Would be my suggestion.
There's an element in back when Volkswagen had the Beetle and the microbus. I had each of those back in the 70s. And there was, I think, a German term called Farfignugan, and it was the fun factor, is the way I understood it. And I think the G90 is one of several radios that you'd have to invoke Farfignugan to explain their popularity. The G90 came out okay, Rob's received test. I mean, it wasn't spectacular. It wasn't terrible. The worst one he's ever had on there is an ICOM R71. I mean, it was one of those that landed in people. No, I'm sorry, that's EHAM. That wasn't right. But on the EHAM, the R71, I don't know what it did wrong, but when it came off the manufacturing line, EHAM didn't like it. But the G90 has such a fun factor with it. And in talking with hams, some will have far more expensive radios that they wind up using the G90 because they like it. Walt Hudson, who has the Salty Walt YouTube, he lives in Virginia. He throws the counterpoints out into the saltwater ocean and works multiple continents usually. And he just says the G90 is so much fun.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you captured that, but there's certainly an element of that, and I pick up on it on EHAM. Ken, I want to call on you. Being a former professor, I used to call on people in class.
All right.
For VCV, you've been looking at stuff. I've been watching you while I was talking. And I knew you had some thoughts. I'd really like to hear what they are.
Okay, there's 2 or 3. You mentioned right at near the beginning, about the Hillbilling radio from Germany. And I've seen one. I will never buy one because they're too bloody expensive. But what's the difference between something of the highest range, which I think is a hillbilling, well, for cost anyway, and like the ICOM 7851, I think that's another one.
Yeah, 7851.
And something like run-of-the-mill, very basic ICOM 7400, for example. And is it really worth the cost between buying the radio at $1,000, well, say $2,000, or one of a hillbilling at $20 plus $1,000? That's my first point.
Okay.
My second point, do you want to answer that first?
Well, I can. And I think you've touched on something that's not equal to the Farfignugan thing, but there's a point there. I would say that it's not unlike how much power do you need to make a contact. You know, it's really, you got to get over the noise, and you got to get over it well enough so that the audio is good. We're talking sideband here. You make a great point. Now, I've got a table in here. I want to point out the rise of the premium radio. And it may be that ICOM invented, if you will, the premium radio, because early on they started charging. And Ray Novak, at least in the States, I don't know what the UK ICOM sales rep would say, Ken, but if we build a high quality radio, people will buy it. You know, build it and they will purchase. So I agree with you. I would never buy Hilberling. No offense. I could buy many other things for the same price, right? And that difference for me, I would have a hard time doing it. So that's my comment. I think you've touched on a very key element. No manufacturer wants you to say that out loud, but I think you've touched on a very key element.
Okay, Frank. Second point. Obviously, I'm looking now at receive noise. I don't use expensive radios. I work lots of DX. There is no doubt about that. But I've got one of the very cheapest radios on the market. It's an FT450 Delta.
I had one. I had one. Yeah.
And for VHF, I don't run an IC 9700 modern. I use an old HF radio that's got 2 meters. So for VHF, I use an ICOM 746. And my point is, I think, yes, I could go out tomorrow and buy an IC 9700. I could also go out and buy at least a £2,000 transceiver for HF instead of my FT450 Delta. However, I think location plays a lot on this. The antenna also does, and what you're going to use it for.
I think you're spot on, Ken. And, there's an old adage. I think the numbers might be overstated. They say if you had 100 pounds, spend 90 on your antenna and 10 on your radio. Well, that no longer fits. But you've got a good point. One of the things, Ken, I think, at least here in the States, that factors into this is rank and file hams are pushed toward compromised antennas because of changes in housing. We have homeowners associations, and almost all of them borrowed boilerplate legal language that says no aerials. Well, they can't truly enforce that because we have aerials on automobiles, right? I mean, you go around and start looking at all areas. But what they want to do is to block amateur CB and a big tower. I mean, that's what they've got in their mind. And the attorney who wrote that probably wasn't a ham and didn't have that to kind of push out. But I think the pressure toward compromised antennas have left so many in the U.S. to, spending their money on the, as Martin put it, the eye candy radio. I'm a little bit. I live in an HOA. I fortunately have an attic that I've been able to put some antennas in, and there is a magnolia tree next to my house that might have 4 antennas in it. But I didn't say that. I said it might, but it sure looks like a magnolia tree. And so hams are, in the States at least, are pushed toward that. I know Martin has a little bit of a challenge where he lives in getting antennas outside. And so that may be a more common problem. But you can absolutely work the world without what we might call a big, expensive radio.
Yeah.
I
Well,
knew you had some good thoughts as I, from teaching classes over the years. I became pretty good at looking at people's faces. So I knew you had some thoughts, Ken. You had some good ones.
Well, I mean, I experiment a lot with vertical polarization and horizontal, and I'm presently using the simplest of antennas, which is for 40 meters or 15 meters, a horizontal dipole at 20 feet above ground with a reflector wire underneath it, 0.2 wavelength below. And I can tell you that I've got zero, well, I won't say zero, I'll say S1 noise. So on the old cheap radio with the simplest of wires, I can have contacts all over Europe. I've also worked into the States with that very low dipole for NVIS, and it is probably one of the best aerials, with giving me a lot of satisfaction with such low noise level. And I think Martin summed it up when he said, what works for you is important. And I think that's what it is, combined with the eye candy type thing. And I've also got a G90, and I love that. So, it's what works for the individual in the location.
Isn't coming up with a new antenna or changing an antenna and it works well, isn't that so exciting?
Correct. And especially if you build it yourself, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Keith, I'm going around the room. I've seen you smiling, and I know you've got some thoughts as well. GM4 JKZ.
Yeah, good evening, Frank. That's a very good talk, I must admit. And I was just thinking, my original radio was a KW2000. But one of my favourites I've still got is an ICOM 765, and that's because I like to twiddle knobs, so to speak, rather than run software. But my main one I use is an FTDX 3000, which doesn't bode brilliantly, but delivers everything that I look for. I run mainly RTTY, and the last contest I managed to get into Tasmania. So
Wow.
With a DS Commander vertical I've got out in the garden. But the advantage I also have is that I'm in the middle of nowhere up here in the borders, so my noise level is virtually zero, much to the annoyance of others in the club, shall I say.
Right. But I have less noise than I would have expected. Most of our utilities in my neighborhood are underground. I don't know if that helps, but my shack is on the second floor. And as we all know from the books, don't run a ground wire. It'll be an antenna. Well, Tom Roush, W8JI, who worked at Ameritron and then MFJ and designed some of the Ameritron equipment, he lives over in Middle Georgia now. He has a contest station in a barn on the second floor. And he has some interesting writing about making a false ground. And when I was building this house 13 years ago, before they put the carpet down, I came in and I put copper strips 1 foot apart. And when they crisscrossed, I soldered them. And then over in a corner of this particular room, there's a little alcove with built-ins, and that's where my shack is. And I had a thick copper strap that went by, and I had a PVC pipe that goes down, and I have 3 ground rods. And gosh, you could start a fist fight in the pub by saying that's the way you should do grounds, right? I don't know if it is or not, but I had one shot at doing it before the house was finished. And And so I had PVC run up the attic. I had PVC running down. I've never had a problem with feedback, with RF feedback. Most of them, when I used an MFJ 931 false ground, you can hook it up and you can actually test to see how your ground's operating. And in fact, I sold the 931s and I don't need it anymore. I don't have any real problems. I wound up buying one later, portable ops though. That's bad when you sell something and then have to buy it again, right? So my noise, maybe because I've been lucky to, to get a few things right, maybe. Sometimes on some bands, it's worse than others. But you are very fortunate. I grew up out in a rural area, and I remember as a child listening on AM broadcast in Georgia, listening to a basketball game out in Los Angeles all the way on AM radio. The Atlanta Hawks were playing the Los Angeles Lakers, and I listened to them. And in my own mind, Atlanta won. I don't know if they did or not, but I remember it that way. And if you're 70 years old, you're entitled to your memories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other advantage that I've got here also is that I've got, if you look at the krz.com page of mine, I've got a clear takeoff north through a gap, which is perfect for over the pole. But
Yeah.
behind me, I've got a bit of a hill. So, a lot of the people in the club work 2 meters and what have you. No good for me. I'd have to go mobile up on top of a hill somewhere. But one thing that I did, we have got solar panels here. And there was an article that was it was either ARRL or CQ on how to reduce the noise on the panels by using toroids in the system and running
Right.
a twisted pair rather than a closed loop circuit. So when we had them installed, I got them to do that. And subsequently, other neighbours, I've told them to do that as well, which the installers kindly did for us. It delayed the installation because they had to source the toroids, of course. But it seems to be working quite nicely. Touch wood.
Well, that ingenuity of researching a problem and solving it. Of course, that's the history of ham radio. No, I mean, that's part of what we do. I don't have solar panels. I did have some fluorescent lights in my garage and out adjacent to my garage. Martin's visited me here this past year, and a little alcove there with my test bench. And those the ballast were, they would fail, and they would start generating noise before they failed. And so I had some LEDs put up, but I did a little research, and I trusted what I read in this one case, that there was a certain brand of LED lights that were RFI friendly. They didn't generate much. And so I got an electrician to come put those in. And I actually put a meter around it, and we turned them on just to try to see what was I picking up. And I can't pick up anything with them. I can take a transistor AM radio. I can take a little shortwave radio. I can turn them on, turn them off, and there's absolutely no noise. So I guess, like you, I sort of got a lucky, good solution. But working on noise, I think it's going to be part of our future. Just going to be that way, I think. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Roberto, you've got an American call sign, and your call sign looks somewhat familiar. I don't know if I've worked you or not, but you have any questions in N4XAT? Okay, very much. Nick, I'll be happy to respond to anything.
Okay.
I'm very honored to speak to you. And I think it's an exciting time to sort of take a left or a right of your choosing and chart a new course. And I'm happy to nominally contribute to that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank. Has anyone else in the room got a question or comment they want to put to Frank while we've got him here? Last chance, everyone.
I'm good on QRZ. Just pop an email there. If I'm slow responding, it's because my arm will be in a sling after Tuesday. So I will get back to you. But thanks again.
Frank, you referenced Rick, DJ Zero IP, a very good friend of mine. And his website that you referenced in your talk there, with the data work that was done in Europe on, looking at some of these radios. I mean, his website is the most phenomenal
Phenomenal.
amount of data on antennas, radios, and the amount of time that I know Rick spends personally doing tests and, charting those tests and doing measurements is just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
He is a real asset to the amateur community. Please, since you're a good friend, please tell him I said thank you, because I certainly benefited from him curating the data. And I don't know if he had seen the PW articles or the CQ article, but please forward that to him with my thanks.
Yeah, I will do, Frank. Yeah, he's going to come back to the club and do a talk for us in the new year. But even when he comes to do it, I mean, I know, Frank, you did the heavy lifting on this in the original articles that you wrote in your original paper, and then of course the publishing it in Practical Wireless. So the gist of what you're doing for this talk was already really prepared in that original paper that you wrote, and the stuff you did in CQ and so on, QST. But I know with Rick, if I say to Rick, will you come along and talk at the club on a subject that I know he knows a phenomenal about, he will spend months and months and months working on it to get the presentation right. And he did us a two-part series. It's on the we've saved it in the Denby Dale site that we look after in Pennine Ham here, on the off-center fed dipole and constructing balance, and the work he put into it and the data sheets that went with it are just invaluable for anybody. And Frank, you'll know this as well, Frank. Rick is a very good friend of Rob Sherwood's as well. So there's a tie up between a number of people really who, as you said, are just extraordinary contributors to amateur radio.
Well, and I couldn't have done any of this without him, because, as you know, the data weren't there. But let me dovetail one other thing Rick did. On his website, I began looking at horizontal loops a couple of years ago. And I had strapped one up when I built this house, and it kind of worked, and I used ladder line, but it got a lot of noise from the AC. But anyway, that's beside the point. I did my research, and I ran across Rick's site, and he mentioned a ham who's east of me in Alabama, in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Well, at the time, my son was assistant golf coach there, so I was going there. And I made a friend with this guy, and he had some measurements that very few hams have. He actually put 4 poles up and built a square for a horizontal loop and did some measurements. Well, and he's a phenomenal ham, and so I'm curating his papers on K4FMH.com, because he kind of just doesn't fool with that, And I said, look, I'm happy to do that. My point is, by helping others share what they've done, we are helping us all, and you just never know when someone's going to run across something that is kind of a I don't know about breakthrough, but really an advance for them. So. I'm very pleased to send thanks to Rick, and I need to get up with Rob Sherwood again. This health thing is kind of taking me out of the loop a little bit. So, but anyway.
Well, Frank, thank you very much indeed for coming along today and giving us that talk. It was as high a standard as everyone you've done, and lots of what you give us. I think, Frank, is food for thought. You kind of challenge us all to say, I'm comfortable with this, but actually, perhaps I need to think about this, and that I think in a hobby, and Martin alluded to this at the beginning when we were just talking informally there, Frank, in a hobby which is developing all the time, because the extraordinary developments in both computing and computing as part of building radios is something which is just moving us forward so quickly. And as amateurs, if we don't move with that and learn something from that and learn something new, then this hobby is going to just disappear. It's going to be a little historical society, like the guys that go off and you know, do presentations of great battles of, 200 years ago. It'll
Right.
be like that. And I don't think most of us, we all like the history and we like the past, but actually, if we're going to enjoy the hobby, we want to learn new things and try out different things. And that's what you've opened up for us, I think.
Well, thank you for very kind words. And Pennine Ham, you're following that path, and I'm just excited to see that. So anytime I can do anything for you, Nick, just call on me. I'm happy to.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you very much, Frank. And thank you to our viewers on YouTube tonight. And I hope those that catch up with this video later enjoy it as well. So I'm going to say good night to our